First story. So, this happened a few years ago, and I still think about it often. I was living in New York City at the time, doing the typical 9 to 5 grind. I worked as an analyst for a financial firm, nothing glamorous, just crunching numbers all day, drinking too much coffee, and dreading Monday mornings like the plague. Anyway, I had a very specific routine. Every day, I'd take the same train from the same platform at the same time. You know how it goes when you live in the city for a while, your life turns into this robotic series of actions that you can do on autopilot. I'd wake up, shower, down a quick breakfast, usually something unhealthy like a muffin or a bagel, then bolt out the door to catch the 7:45 a.m. train. That particular morning, though, everything was off. I woke up late. Somehow, my alarm didn't go off, or maybe it did, and I just hit snooze in my sleep. I honestly don't remember. What I do remember is the sheer panic when I looked at the clock and saw it was already 7:30. That left me exactly 15 minutes to get out of bed, get dressed, and get to the station, which was a solid 10-minute walk from my apartment. Not ideal, right? I scrambled like a madman, threw on the first clothes I could find, grabbed my keys, and bolted out the door. As I was running down the street, I could already see the train in my mind pulling away from the platform without me. But when I got to the station, something odd happened. The train was delayed. It was weird because the 7:45 train was usually punctual to the minute, but I didn't think too much of it. I was just relieved I hadn't missed it. But then, another announcement came over the loudspeaker: the 7:45 train has been cancelled due to mechanical issues. The next train will depart at 8:15. I was irritated, but what can you do? It was either wait or find an alternate route, and since I wasn't too familiar with the bus schedules, I opted to wait. I sat down on one of the cold, metal benches, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling through emails, trying to catch up on work. I barely noticed the guy who sat down next to me a few minutes later. He was a bit older than me, probably mid-40s, wearing a beat-up leather jacket and jeans that had seen better days. He looked like he hadn't shaved in a few days, and there was this tired, world-weary vibe about him. I didn't think much of it at first, until he struck up a conversation. "You heading into the city too?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, work. Train's delayed though." He chuckled, like he found something amusing about the situation. "Yeah, I've been riding this line for years. They always find a way to screw up when you least expect it." We exchanged a few more pleasantries, and I was half ready to tune him out and go back to my phone, but then he said something that caught me off guard. "I used to work in finance, like you, actually," he said, glancing at my shirt and tie. "But I quit. Best decision I ever made." Now, I've heard people say things like that before, but there was something in the way he said it that made me curious. There was no arrogance or superiority in his tone, just a calm conviction. I couldn't help myself. I asked, "Why'd you quit?" He leaned back, letting out a long breath, like he was about to dive into a story he hadn't told in a while. "I worked for one of the big firms. Made good money, had a nice apartment in the city, all that. But one day, I just realized I wasn't happy. I'd wake up every morning with this pit in my stomach, knowing I'd spend the next 10 hours staring at spreadsheets, attending pointless meetings, and kissing up to people I didn't respect." I nodded, not entirely unfamiliar with that feeling myself, though I'd never admit it out loud. "So, what did you do?" He smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I quit on a whim. No plan, no backup. Just walked into my boss's office one day and handed in my resignation. He thought I was crazy. Maybe I was." "What did you do after that?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "I traveled," he said, his voice softening. "I'd always wanted to see the world, but I never had time, you know? There was always another deal to close, another report to write. So, I took all the savings I had, bought a one-way ticket to Thailand, and didn't look back." "Wow," I muttered, trying to imagine what that would be like. "That's brave. I don't think I could ever do something like that." He looked at me for a moment, like he was sizing me up. It's not about being brave. It's about being honest with yourself. Most people know deep down when they're unhappy, but they're too scared to change anything. They convince themselves it's easier to stay in their comfort zone, even if that comfort zone is making them miserable. I didn't say anything for a while, just sat there thinking about what he'd said. He was right, of course, but it wasn't as simple as just walking away from everything. Or was it? The train finally arrived, and we both got on. He sat across from me, and we continued talking the entire ride into the city. He told me about his travels, how he'd spent months living in tiny villages in Southeast Asia, learning from people who had nothing but were somehow happier than anyone he'd ever met in the corporate world. He said he'd found work here and there, odd jobs that paid just enough to keep him going. But more than anything, he said, he found peace. When we got to Penn Station, we parted ways. He gave me a quick nod and a smile before disappearing into the sea of commuters. I never got his name, and I never saw him again, but something about that conversation stuck with me. For the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, about being honest with yourself, about stepping out of your comfort zone. It gnawed at me, that realization that I was living a life that felt more like a trap than a choice. I didn't quit my job right away, but I started making small changes. I took up a hobby I'd always wanted to try, photography, and started planning trips outside the city, even if it was just for a weekend. Slowly but surely, I began to feel that spark again, that excitement for life I hadn't felt in years. I still work in finance, but now, I'm saving up for a big trip of my own. Maybe one day, I'll buy that one-way ticket and finally take the leap. Who knows? But I'll never forget that stranger and how a missed train ended up changing the course of my life. Second story. So, I've been debating whether or not to share this story for a while now, but here goes. This happened about 2 years ago, and it completely changed the way I look at people, especially the ones I thought I knew well. I had a best friend, Mike. We met in college, and right off the bat, we clicked. We were both engineering majors, both loved the same terrible action movies, and had this shared sense of humor that made it seem like we were on the same wavelength 24/7. After we graduated, we both got jobs in the same city and ended up moving in together, which made sense because rent was insane, and we figured why not. We'd been best friends for almost 5 years at that point, and it was a pretty seamless transition from dorm life to real-world roommates. Now, Mike was one of those guys who could make friends with anyone. He had this charisma about him, always the life of the party, the guy everyone gravitated toward at social events. I'm more of the quiet type, so I guess that's part of why we got along so well. He could carry a conversation, make introductions, and I'd just follow his lead. It was great. Anyway, things were pretty normal for the first year or so. We'd hang out, grab beers after work, watch games on the weekends. It was the kind of friendship that felt like it could last forever. But then, little things started to change, and looking back, I realize I missed all the signs. Mike started to become secretive, and at first, I didn't think much of it. He'd come home late some nights, saying he had to stay at work, but his excuses never quite added up. Then, there were weekends where he'd disappear for the entire day, and when I asked him about it, he'd give these vague answers like, "Oh, just running some errands." It was weird, but I figured everyone has their own personal stuff going on, and I didn't want to pry. The turning point came one Friday night. We were supposed to go out with some friends, but at the last minute, Mike bailed. He said he wasn't feeling well, so I went without him. The night was fun, but when I got home around 1 a.m., something was off. Our apartment was quiet, too quiet, and I noticed Mike's car wasn't in the driveway. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe he went to the store or something, but then I noticed his laptop was open on the coffee table, and curiosity got the better of me. Now, before you judge me for what I did next, understand that at this point, I'd started to feel like something was seriously off with Mike. So, yeah, I snooped a little. I opened his laptop to see what he'd been up to, and what I found knocked the wind out of me. There were dozens of messages from people I didn't recognize, and they were all about money, large sums of money. The conversations were cryptic, but it didn't take long to figure out that Mike was involved in some shady stuff. There were mentions of deals going through and cutting people out. It wasn't clear what he was doing exactly, but it was obvious this wasn't legal. I sat there for a good 10 minutes, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just found. This was my best friend, the guy I'd known for years, and suddenly, it felt like I didn't know him at all. I debated whether or not to confront him, but in the end, I decided to wait and see how things played out. The next morning, Mike came back home acting like nothing had happened. I watched him closely, trying to figure out if there was any guilt or tension in his behavior, but he was as relaxed and carefree as ever. It was unsettling, to say the least. For the next few weeks, I kept my distance, but I also kept an eye on him. I started noticing more inconsistencies in his stories, more late nights, more secrecy. It was eating me alive, not knowing what was going on, so I finally broke down and told another mutual friend about it. Let's call him Jake. Jake was shocked when I told him, but he wasn't entirely surprised. He said he'd noticed some weird behavior from Mike too, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Together, we decided to do a little more digging, not because we wanted to be nosy, but because we were genuinely worried. We'd known Mike for years, and this wasn't like him. At least, it wasn't like the Mike we thought we knew. One weekend, while Mike was out of town on business, Jake and I went through some of his stuff. I know, it was a serious invasion of privacy, but we didn't know what else to do. And that's when we found the real bombshell. Hidden in the back of Mike's closet was a box filled with cash. Not just a little cash, a lot of cash. We're talking thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, all neatly bundled together. There was also a burner phone and a notebook filled with names, dates, and numbers. We didn't understand all of it, but it didn't take a genius to figure out that Mike was mixed up in something illegal, probably drugs, based on some of the text messages we'd seen earlier. I felt sick to my stomach. This was the guy I'd trusted, the guy I'd shared my life with for years, and here he was, living this double life. It was like something out of a movie, but it was happening in real life, and I had no idea what to do. After finding the money, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I confronted Mike as soon as he got back. I'll never forget the look on his face when I told him I knew everything, anger, fear, and something else I couldn't quite place. At first, he denied it, tried to laugh it off like it was no big deal. But when I showed him what I'd found, he broke. He didn't get defensive or try to explain. He just sat there, head in his hands, and said, "I'm in too deep, man. I can't get out." That's when it all came out. Mike had gotten involved in some shady deals through a guy he met at work. It started small, just a few side hustles to make extra cash, but before he knew it, he was laundering money for some pretty serious people. He tried to stop a few times, but every time he did, they threatened him or his family. He was stuck, and he didn't know how to get out. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was furious. How could he let this happen? How could he keep this from me? But another part of me felt sorry for him. He was trapped, and I could see how scared he was. In the end, I told him he needed to go to the police. He refused at first, but after a long night of talking and arguing, he agreed. The next day, he turned himself in, and things got messy after that. Mike ended up cutting a deal with the authorities, and last I heard, he was in witness protection. I haven't seen him since. It's been 2 years now, and I still think about Mike almost every day. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, but I hope he's okay. The whole experience made me realize that no matter how well you think you know someone, there's always more beneath the surface. Third story. Alright, I wasn't planning on sharing this, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately. It's the kind of story that makes you realize how fragile and random life can be, and how a single moment can push you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about yourself. This happened about 3 years ago. I was working as a marketing consultant for a mid-sized tech company. It wasn't a dream job by any means, but it paid well enough, and it was the kind of work that didn't make me want to rip my hair out every day. I was good at it, too. I had climbed the ranks pretty quickly since starting there after college. By 28, I was managing a small team and had the company's top clients under my wing. On paper, everything was going great. I had a nice apartment, a solid social life, and a career that most people would consider successful. But if I'm being honest, I wasn't happy. Not that I hate my life, a kind of unhappiness, but the low level, is this it, kind. You know what I mean? I was just coasting, going through the motions, living for weekends that disappeared way too fast, and dreading Mondays. I had a gnawing feeling that something was missing, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Then came the meeting. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon, and I was scheduled to give a presentation to one of our big clients. Nothing unusual there, I'd done it 100 times before. I had all my slides ready, data polished, talking points rehearsed. It was a straightforward update on our latest marketing initiatives, something I could do in my sleep. But right before I walked into the conference room, my boss, Jason, pulled me aside. "Hey, Sam," he said, his tone way too casual for what came next. "I need you to tone it down a bit today." I blinked, not sure if I heard him right. "Tone it down?" He nodded, giving me one of those awkward, uncomfortable looks you get from someone when they're about to drop something they know you won't like. "Yeah. You've been doing great work, but some of the guys in the room don't like how confident you come across. It rubs them the wrong way." I was stunned. Confident? That was a bad thing now? What do you mean, rub them the wrong way? I'm just doing my job. Jason shifted his weight from one foot to the other, avoiding eye contact. I know, but it's just, you know how it is. They don't want to feel like you're outshining them. Just dial it back a little, okay? Make it more about them. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to argue, but it felt pointless. So I just nodded, trying to process this bizarre new instruction. I went into that meeting feeling completely off balance. Instead of focusing on the presentation, I was overthinking every word I said, making sure I wasn't coming across as too assertive, or too smart, or whatever it was they didn't like about me. And guess what? The whole thing was a disaster. I stumbled through my talking points, lost my train of thought more than once, and ended up second-guessing myself so much that by the end, even I wasn't convinced by what I was saying. As soon as the meeting was over, I went straight to the bathroom and just stood there in front of the mirror, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. I felt humiliated, not because the presentation had gone poorly, but because I had let someone else's insecurities dictate how I did my job. It was like this weird, out-of-body experience where I suddenly saw myself as this corporate puppet, moving through the motions of a life that wasn't even mine. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep bending over backward to make other people comfortable, especially at the expense of my own self-worth. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, thinking about how I'd ended up here. I remembered all the times over the past year that I had felt like something wasn't right but had pushed it aside because everything else seemed fine. But it wasn't fine. I was burnt out, not just from the workload, but from trying to fit into a mold that wasn't me. The next morning, I walked into Jason's office, and before I could second-guess myself, I told him I needed to take some time off. I didn't know how long I'd be gone, but I needed space to figure things out. To his credit, he didn't fight me on it. He probably saw it coming after how badly the meeting had gone. I ended up taking 2 months off, during which I did some serious soul-searching. I spent more time outdoors, went hiking in places I'd only ever seen in Instagram photos, and started journaling for the first time in my life. It wasn't some magical epiphany where I suddenly knew what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, but it gave me the clarity to see what I didn't want. I didn't want to go back to that same job, in that same office, pretending to be someone I wasn't just to appease people who didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. So, I made the hardest decision of my life, I quit. My friends thought I was crazy. My parents were concerned, of course. Walking away from a good-paying job with no backup plan is not exactly what most people consider smart. But for the first time in a long time, I felt free. It wasn't easy. The months that followed were a roller coaster of anxiety and doubt. I picked up freelance gigs here and there to pay the bills, and for a while, I wondered if I'd made a huge mistake. But slowly, things started to fall into place. I found work that I was passionate about, consulting for small, independent businesses that actually cared about their customers and employees. It wasn't as glamorous as my old job, and the money wasn't as good, but I was finally doing something that felt meaningful. It's been 2 years since I left that corporate world behind, and I've never looked back. I'm not saying it's been smooth sailing. There are still days when I question if I made the right choice, especially when I see my old co-workers posting about their promotions or fancy vacations. But those moments pass. Because deep down, I know I did what was right for me. I guess the moral of the story, if there is one, is that you don't have to settle for a life that doesn't feel like your own. Sometimes it takes a wake-up call, a failed presentation, a moment of clarity in front of a bathroom mirror, to make you see that the path you're on isn't the only one. And when you finally have the guts to step off that path, you might just find something better waiting for you. So yeah, that's my story. I didn't expect one awkward meeting to change my life, but in a way, it did.